Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Another Place, Another Time, Chapter 2, From Blankenfelde to the Bismarck. On September the 26th, 1940, I walked with my mother from our house in Blankenfelde to the train station at nearby Dahlewitz to catch a commuter train into Berlin. There at the Anhalter Bahnhof, I boarded a train for Stralsund on the Baltic to report for basic training. This was to be the first of many wartime train journeys, and I found that train travel in Germany changed according to the fortunes of war. Intercity railway carriages had a corridor along one side, feeding into individual compartments for up to 6 or 8 people. Sometimes one could stretch out in a compartment, and sometimes there was standing room only in the corridor. The compartment benches in third class were wooden, but in second class they were upholstered. There was no first class. I don't recall there being a dining car on these trains, and we usually took snacks with us. Not yet an officer, only a humble Offiziersanwärter, I travelled to Stralsund on a third-class ticket, sitting on a wooden bench and wearing civilian clothes. September 1940 was supposedly a good time in the war for Germany. The campaigns in Poland, Norway, France and the Low Countries had been brought to a successful conclusion, although not without losses, and the only enemy remaining was Britain. There was, however, no euphoria over the recent victories, as they did not appear to have led to a satisfactory conclusion. If Germany had won, why was there no peace agreement with Britain? This was typical of the German attitude to the war, as I recall it. There was no great excitement over the good times, just as there was no great anxiety when things started to go downhill and disaster loomed. Individuals reacted, on the other hand, according to their personal experiences and/or tragedies. At this point in my life, I was excited at finally beginning my long-cherished ambition of a naval career, although my feelings were tempered with a certain apprehension about what was awaiting me in challenges and hardships. In the Kriegsmarine, all officer cadets joining at the same time formed what was called, using the English word, a crew, or class in German, and each crew was identified by the year and sometimes the month of joining, not by the year of graduation, as is the case with the United States Navy. I was about to become a member of Crew 40, but ahead of me stretched months and years of training and many hurdles to overcome before I became a commissioned officer. The first obstacle was to get through the Schiffsstammabteilung, or boot camp. If there's one thing that unites Western nations, it is the military boot camp, which, contrary to popular belief, is not an exercise in furthering human dignity or the building of self-esteem. The process of basic training is the same in most armed forces. The recruit is isolated from civilian society, subjected to rigid and often not very logical discipline, and taught the basics of service life. How to wear and care for a uniform, how to salute and whom to salute, how to drill and march in formation, how to fire weapons, and how to suffer through much strenuous physical exercise. For reasons that I, and probably anyone else who has had the misfortune to undergo this process, have never been able to understand, much of it is accomplished at the double, accompanied by frequent loud, shouted orders. The essential purpose of this process is to make the recruit realize that he is no longer a sloppy, happy-go-lucky civilian, but a disciplined and self-sufficient cog in a greater machine. It is to teach him that he is now part of a community and that he must learn to live with others in barracks. I and my fellow officer aspirants of Crew 40 underwent this process at the 7th Schiffsstammabteilung, the naval basic training camp at Denholm Island near Stralsund. The camp was a mixture of modern buildings and structures dating back to the First World War, when it had been used for a similar purpose. My training unit was housed in one of the older buildings, which needed more effort to keep clean, as we soon discovered, and for which we were pitied by those of our comrades who were fortunate enough to be accommodated in the more modern barracks built around a large drill square. We were housed 6 to a room, slept in standard military bunks, and performed our ablutions in the one large communal washroom in each building. When the time came to clean the barracks, however, I was excused from this fatigue, as I provided entertainment for my perspiring comrades by playing current hit songs on my accordion. Meals were taken in a very large mess hall, with everyone picking up their food from a line of kitchen staff. There was little enthusiasm for the rather bland food, which we were convinced was spiked with liberal doses of potassium nitrite, or saltpeter, to keep our libidos under control. Although we were destined to become naval officers, our time at the Denholm was largely concerned with learning how to be infantrymen. We received field grey army uniforms, which were differentiated only by our naval brass buttons from those worn by the Heer, or German army, which had aluminum buttons, and we also received military Arbeitspäckchen, or fatigue dress. We were, however, supplied by a blue sailor's uniform for formal parades and occasional, but rare, leave in nearby Stralsund. During my time at the Denholm, there was a shortage of naval instructors, and as a result, army NCOs served in this capacity, and one of these was in charge of my training unit. Surprisingly, and thankfully, he was rather gentle and rarely lost his composure or temper, in distinct contrast to most of the other instructors. Enlisted personnel as well as officer cadets also underwent basic training at the Denholm, but during the time I spent there in October and November of 1940, we were all officer aspirants because the two groups never trained at the same time. Our days certainly did not end at 5 p.m, and when they did end, we were much too tired to do anything, particularly to get into trouble. I cannot remember much about what we did in our limited spare time, but we probably talked, read, played cards, and so on. Near the end of October, we experienced the most important day of our short time in service when we underwent the solemn swearing-in ceremony. This day began with a moving service at the magnificent Nikolai Church in Stralsund, where the Navy chaplain delivered a sermon that left a deep impression on me. It continued with the administration of the oath under the eyes of Admiral Wilhelm Marschall in the big drill square. After swearing our loyalty to our country, we finally felt we had become real soldiers. From this day on, we were entitled to shore leave, and we received our first pass to get out of camp for a few hours, which we did in our blue dress sailors' uniforms. We went no farther than Stralsund and did little more than go to a restaurant and have a good meal. Because at this point we were very aware of the importance of proper behavior while ashore, and therefore the consumption of alcohol and the pursuit of females were considered rather dangerous and reluctantly avoided. On December 4th, 1940, my training unit had its final inspection by the commander of the Denholm, and after a satisfactory performance we handed in our infantry uniforms and equipment and packed our bags. A large and very happy farewell party marked the end of this, the first chapter of our service careers, and then those of us in the engineering branch boarded a special train to Flensburg to begin our first workshop course. It took us 28 hours to travel the 210 miles to Flensburg-Mürwik, where we were to receive our initial technical training. We were met by a lieutenant and some sailors and ordered to load ourselves and our luggage into trucks for the trip to the nearby Marineschule, the German Naval Academy and the equivalent of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. Our workshop course was not actually part of the Marineschule curriculum, we just used its facilities. Our quarters were on board the passenger liner Caribia, moored in Flensburg harbor, and this was typical of the wartime Kriegsmarine, as most of Germany's passenger vessels were tied up in various ports to serve as accommodation ships for the personnel of a rapidly expanding service. For us, however, living on a passenger liner was a welcome change from the drafty huts at the Denholm, and I had a cabin, not very large, all to myself. The first days of our workshop course were occupied in getting familiar with our new environment. If we thought life was going to get any easier, we quickly learned that our time at the Denholm had actually been rather carefree, and it had now come to an end. The workshop course was intended to put both our intellect and technical dexterity to the test. The daily routine consisted of lectures in the morning and workshop practice in the afternoon, interrupted periodically by sports, rowing, infantry drills, watchkeeping or guard duty, and other activities regarded as necessary for the proper education of a young officer. The morning lessons began with rather basic lectures in physics that most of us knew already from high school, but soon progressed to more advanced topics such as marine engines, boilers, turbines, pumps, generators and the characteristics of electricity. In addition, we were taught how to behave on board a warship, received lectures on German naval history, and were also compelled to attend certain social events at which our behavior was closely observed. There was much practical work on the curriculum. Our first experience at the metalworking shop involved being issued a set of files and being told to produce a perfect cube out of a ball of steel, which was quite a shock for those of us who had more theoretical than practical backgrounds. The 8 weeks of the workshop course were evenly divided into training in the metalworking shop, welding shop, blacksmith shop, and finally a shop where we learned to operate a lathe. All the pieces we produced had to be designed, documented with drawings and certified by the group officer. All of it, of course, was interesting and satisfying work, although it required much labor. If we thought that long hours spent during military drill were behind us, we were rudely reminded on the first day at the Marineschule that we were in the Navy. While we were in the workshop, our group officer inspected our cabins on the Caribia and was not happy about what he found, as we had not been living up to the standard expected of would-be officers. To put it plainly, our cabins were a mess. The result was that we now became acquainted with the hoary old German naval tradition known as the Maskenball, which is the masquerade ball, or Signal Flag Lucy. This involved having to report to the group officer on the deck of the Caribia with all our bed linen neatly folded for inspection. then being given 5 minutes to return to our cabins, remake our bunks and be back on deck in work clothing. We then got another 5 minutes to report back in pajamas, followed by another 5 minutes to be back in blue uniform, and finally 5 minutes to report in gym clothes. Slightly out of breath, we realized that if we wished to become officers in the Kriegsmarine, discipline and neatness were important matters. Flag Lucy was an off-duty entertainment we were subjected to quite frequently, often for small digressions committed by various individuals, as the ruling principle was one for all and all for one. It did not help that on December 20th, 1940, we received a week of home leave. This was, of course, the highlight of our naval careers so far, but on our return to Flensburg we apparently had, as it was pointedly made clear to us, reverted to our sloppy civilian ways again, and the appropriate remedies were immediately applied. During the winter of 1940 to 1941, the weather was not always very pleasant, and sometimes the ice in Flensburg harbor was so thick that the boat service from the Caribia to the shore had to be suspended. One of our watchkeeping duties consisted of spreading salt over the ice-covered expanse of the landing quay at the Marineschule, a job we could have done without. Halfway through the workshop course we held our Bergfest, a ceremony to celebrate having reached the peak of the mountain and the fact that we would now look forward to an easier descent. On this occasion, Admiral Marshall again visited us and delivered a speech about the required traits of a naval officer. To be a leader, he told us, we had to acquire 3 things: experience, judgment, and instinct. The first could only be gained in the practical environment provided by service on a warship, and this would therefore be the next part of our training, while the other 2 would develop after many years in various commands. The Admiral also emphasized the importance of a sound relationship between an officer and his subordinates. It was necessary that both sides display absolute respect for the other, and both sides had to accept the fact that no human being is perfect. After this professional and spiritual enlightenment, however, the powers that be decided that we still needed some physical strengthening, and we immediately received more infantry training. The infantry drills of the workshop course, for which we were issued rifles, made us long for the rather harmless exercises we had carried out at the Denholm, and after some exposure to them and various rugged sports, we were usually ready to collapse. Dance parties, visits to the theater, and informal conversations with our officers, though, did help to make us feel human again. In the middle of February of 1941, our first workshop course came to an end. After a final and satisfactory inspection, we were promoted to cadet, which is a naval cadet. We now turned in our well-thumbed textbooks and had a grand farewell party because the next chapter of our training was sea duty. In peacetime, the tradition had been that, following their initial studies, cadets served for several months on board of one of the full-sailing training barks, Gorch Horst Wessel, and Leo Albert Schlageter, which sometimes made long cruises to foreign ports. For Crew 40, unfortunately, the war meant that our seagoing time would be shorter and spent on operational warships. Of course, no one asked for our preferences about our choice of vessel, and it was therefore with great delight that I learned on February 16, 1940, that I was to report on board the destroyer Hans Lody, Z-10. I was elated about being assigned to a destroyer, since we Kadetten always preferred smaller warships because of the closer and less formal relationships of the crew than on a Dickschiff, which is literally a thick ship. Late in the evening of a very wintry day, I reported to the Hans Lody at Wesermünde with a comrade from the workshop course. I well remember being somewhat awestruck when I first saw her tied up at the dock. Finally, my childhood dreams had come true, and I was about to go to sea. I was fascinated by the activities on the ship, its noise, the steam escaping from somewhere, and also the unique smell of a warship. This initial impression was so strong that it has remained with me for the rest of my life. Decades later, when I drove each morning to work along Lakeshore Boulevard in Toronto and passed the Second World War Canadian destroyer HMCS Haida at her dock at Ontario Place, I would get a strange but strong urge to turn off and show up for duty. Stepping on board the Hans Lody and reporting to the officer of the watch was a rather informal affair, but we were immediately made aware of the insignificance of our status when we were turned over to a petty officer who showed us to the cadet quarters and then left. Rather tired, I stumbled over some sleeping bodies and with effort located a hammock and a place to string it up. I just wanted to sleep. We Kadetten were accommodated in the large aft sailor's mess deck, and like many German sailors, we slept in hammocks. Around the periphery of the mess deck were nooks with tables accommodating 6 to 8 men, and one was assigned to our group of 6 Kadetten, 2 aspiring engineer officers and 4 aspiring Seeoffiziere or executive branch cadets, the latter having arrived straight from the Denholm. The next morning we were kept busy running from one officer to another to inform each of our existence. We were then sent ashore to the station to pick up our Seesäcke or duffel bags which had been left there the night before. Back on board, we were assigned our duties, and later that evening, we cadets celebrated our recent promotion on the aft deck and invited some of the ship's officers as well. Even the commanding officer, Korvettenkapitän Werner Pfeiffer, joined us and at midnight used the opportunity to start celebrating his birthday. It was 2 a.m. before we fell asleep, but the next morning, our cadet officer, Oberleutnant zur See Karl-Heinz Vorsteher, who was also the ship's gunnery officer, thought it prudent to get us back to life with a 2-hour session of strenuous sports. If we thought that being on an operational warship was going to be easier than the Denholm or the workshop course, we were soon disabused of that notion. We Kadetten quickly learned that service on a warship was absolutely no excuse for neglecting to keep ourselves and our surroundings neat and tidy. When I at first looked at the size of my locker, I wondered how I could get all my stuff into it, but in the end I squeezed it all in. But not according to naval standards. Oberleutnant zur See Vorsteher inspected our lockers and was not happy about what he discovered. My comrades being found similarly negligent, we spent an hour being chased around the Lody until we were totally out of breath, all in the name of officer education. Untidy lockers were not our only transgressions. There was a standing order on the destroyer for the crew not to leave any personal items in their jackets when they hung them up, but we only found out about this regulation when Oberleutnant zur See Vorsteher searched our jackets and removed their contents. We got them back one by a process similar to Signal Flag Lucy, receiving one item at a time from Vorsteher after having reported to him in a different uniform. At the Denholm or the workshop course we had become inured to such rituals, but we could not understand why we had to undergo them on board a fighting warship. Not that the Hans Lody made a very great contribution to the German naval war effort. After my arrival, it took many weeks before this ship even moved for the first time, as there were seemingly endless problems with the destroyer's machinery, which was repaired only to be followed by tests and further problems. The Hans Lody was a Type 34A destroyer, the first class of destroyers constructed by the Kriegsmarine after the lifting of the tonnage restrictions imposed by the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. The Type 34 vessels were 374 feet in length, 37 feet in beam, displaced 3,190 tons, and had a crew of 283 officers and sailors. They were armed with 5 12.7 cm, which is 5-inch, guns in single turrets, 4 3.7 cm and 6 2 cm anti-aircraft guns, and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. Since I was an engineer cadet, however, I was more concerned with the propulsion machinery, and this consisted of 6 Benson steam boilers and 2 Wagner geared turbines, which nominally gave the Lody a top speed of 36 knots. The high-pressure Benson boilers represented experimental propulsion plants and were notorious for their temperamental operation and poor service record. A few years ago, I acquired a copy of a 1941 technical assessment done by the Kriegsmarine itself on the quality of German surface warship design, and it was disastrous. Our destroyers were, on average, unserviceable about 42% of the time they were in commission, and of the 12 Type 34 ships in our navy, only 4 were ready for sea at any given time. We engineering cadetten on the Lody were uncomfortably aware of the problems posed by the Benson boiler and of the rather unpleasant consequences of any leaks or damage to our steam pipes. A pin-sized hole in a pipe would produce a jet of high-powered steam that would go right through a human body in its way. We were therefore very alert when on duty, as were all the engine room personnel. Our daily routine was a constant succession of watches in the engine rooms, cleaning and maintenance of the propulsion plant, lectures, tests and exams, sleeping, eating, interrupted sometimes by sports or infantry drills, and the occasional recuperation provided by rare visits ashore. On a warship there are no weekends, holidays or 9 to 5 days, and our shipboard life was dominated by the requirement to learn and learn. At one time, the Navy had obviously discovered that keeping clean the floor plates in the engine rooms of a warship was not a very pleasant job, and we believed that this was about the same time they invented the cadet, because cleaning floor plates occupied an inordinate amount of our time. Guess who received this dirty job and who was required to climb into a boiler and clean the insides? I remember that, while cleaning the boilers, I had to emerge every 10 minutes to let the soles of my shoes cool down before returning to work, so hot was the interior. By trading some watches with a stoker, I was, however, able to have 2 half-days free so that I could go ashore and celebrate my 18th birthday with my mother, who travelled from Blankenfelde to Wesermünde for the occasion. On board the Lody, we were also taught that part of our officer education was to learn how to drink properly. We did not acquire this knowledge as we would have liked on shore in civilian establishments, nor did we learn it in the wardroom, the officers' mess of the destroyer. Being humble Kadetten, the lowest form of life on board, so we were often told, we were not permitted the privileges of that establishment. Our training in this respect was not neglected, however, because one evening Oberleutnant zur See Vorsteher appeared in our mess, accompanied by sailors carrying cases of beer, and invited us to drink with them. There was no way of avoiding this activity, as it was a direct order from a superior, and therefore bottle after bottle was consumed until Vorsteher was the only one still functioning. And not a few of us Kadetten were resting comfortably under the table. But Oberleutnant zur See Vorsteher was an officer without mercy, and early next morning he scrutinized each of us carefully, and if there were any signs of dysfunction, we were addressed in a very unpleasant term. These sessions, which occurred more than once, fell under the heading of necessary officer training, and valuable training it was, because we in the Kriegsmarine were proud of the fact that we were about the only large navy in the world of which there was rarely a complaint concerning the behavior of its officers and men ashore in foreign ports. In the middle of March 1941, the Lody finally got up steam and left Wesermünde for Kiel. I found this journey interesting, as we went through the very scenic Kiel Canal to get from the North Sea into the Baltic. Unfortunately, I also found out that, while sailors on deck could admire whatever sights came before their eyes, as a stoker I was confined most of the time to the engine rooms, which did not have any scuttles or portholes. For engineering personnel at sea, it was 6 hours on watch and 6 off, but the latter hours were spent taking care of the rest of our needs, which, if we wanted to eat, included peeling many potatoes. On German warships there was a system of individual small units, the equivalent to a British or Canadian Navy mess, usually consisting of the men at each table in the living quarters. Each mess peeled their own potatoes, which then were transferred to the kombüse or galley in a net container clearly labeled with the mess's identity. After cooking, this net with the potatoes was brought back by a mess member together with the remainder of the meal: meat, soup, fish, sausages, or whatever. The amount of food we consumed was therefore to some extent determined by the industry we devoted to peeling potatoes. At Kiel, our ship was subjected to a seemingly endless series of technical inspection and tests in the dock, in a shipyard, or at sea. In between, I had a few days shore leave, during which I visited my grandparents on my mother's side and also spent some time with my parents who made a visit. I remember that, during the leave, an evening at the opera was a welcome diversion. However, all was not so pleasant, as in Kiel we Kadetten were subjected to an exhausting 2-hour infantry exercise complete with full battle dress and rifles as the very reasonable compensation for one cadet having misbehaved while ashore. Having at long last got her machinery in working order, the Hans Lody now started to carry out exercises in the Baltic with 2 other destroyers, Karl Galster and Hermann Schömann. While undergoing this training, we wore leather gear, gas masks and life preservers, and it involved simulated torpedo attacks, target shooting with our main guns, anti-submarine warfare, attacks with depth charges and formation exercises. After dropping depth charges, we usually came to a stop, lowered all boats and provided personnel on deck with potato nets and waste paper baskets, all in the quest for a delicious meal provided by hundreds of fish floating on the surface, either killed or stunned by the blast. Hits by the enemy were simulated on our ship, and I found myself carrying terribly mutilated bodies on stretchers to the ship's sickbay. I was amazed how much the massive machinery in the engine room shook when the ship fired a full salvo from its 12.7 cm main guns. I also had to struggle with my first attack of seasickness, but they never prevented me from carrying out my duties. I just delivered up my offering to Neptune and became hungry again. These exercises were interrupted by a brief visit to Danzig, where I took the opportunity to see some relatives. Just before Easter in April of 1941, we returned to Wesermünde, and as the Lody entered the harbour, we passed the sad side of the large and once proud ocean liner Bremen, which had been reduced to a burned-out hulk after a crew member had set it on fire. We now commenced another period of repairs, as defective machinery was removed and replaced with new equipment. The Easter holidays were recognized with a general easing of duties and additional goodies for our meals, but holidays they were not, and I remember having to stand watch outside the ship's arrest cell. During the evening on Easter Monday, however, I was finally allowed ashore and saw a performance of Die Fledermaus at the opera. We Kadetten now commenced writing a series of examinations leading towards our eventual promotion to Fähnrich, which is a midshipman. While writing these tests, we were required to wear dress uniform, which puzzled us, but by now, having been 6 months in service, we knew better than to complain. Towards the end of April of 1941, Hans Lody returned to Kiel, to the crew's deep disappointment, as we had all hoped that we would go into action in the North Sea. In Kiel, I was sad to see the widespread destruction British bombers had recently inflicted on the city, and I wondered what the cities in England looked like. Again, we engaged in various tests and exercises and practiced more battle evolutions, mostly in very heavy seas that made it impossible to get from the engine rooms to the aft mess decks. Visits to places like Rønn, on the delightful Danish island of Bornholm, and the harbours of Svinemünde and the island of Rügen were a pleasant change from both training and rough seas. The war, meanwhile, had heated up again in the spring of 1941 when German forces were deployed in southern Europe and North Africa to assist our Italian allies. Although we could follow the progress of the campaigns in the Mediterranean theatre, it all seemed rather remote to us, and we wondered when we would get a chance to go into action. Our opportunity finally came on May the 19th of 1941 when the Lody was ordered to raise steam and proceed to sea. Just before we left Kiel, I had the good luck to see my father, who was now serving as an Unteroffizier in a naval anti-aircraft battery in Denmark. He had some leave and came on board and met both my captain and my group training officer. I suppose he was just checking up on me. On May the 19th, we slipped from our anchorage after night had fallen and at 11 p.m. rendezvoused with the battleship Bismarck, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and the destroyers Z-23 and Friedrich Eckhold, and then set a course due north. In the darkness, the shadowy silhouettes of the big ships made them look like threatening ghosts. In the open sea, we assumed cruising formation with Lody leading, Z-23 on starboard and Friedrich Eckhold on the port, with the big ships side by side in the middle, the whole force steaming at 27 knots. I have learned from post-war reading that our force was sighted by a Swedish cruiser on May the 20th, but I have no recollection of this being reported in the ship at the time, and, of course, I would have had no realization of the significance of this event. Late next morning, on May the 20th of 1941, we approached Bergen in Norway, and for the first time I saw the majestic mountains and fjords I had read so much about. But, of course, as usual, most of the time I was cooped up in the engine room. The destroyers moved deep into the scenic harbor at Bergen to take on fuel and water. Again, from post-war reading, I have learned that our ships were photographed by a British reconnaissance aircraft on this day, but we were not aware of it at the time. At 1900 hours, we moved back to the area where the big ships had anchored and continued our journey. By now, the weather had turned misty and windy. Next morning, at 0500 hours, Bismarck released her escort destroyers and we altered course for Trondheim in Norway, where we arrived about 5 hours later. Once again, we took on fuel and water to be ready for further orders. In the meantime, we were given leave to explore the city and we were also given some Norwegian money. Except for some coffee and cake, however, there was nothing to buy. But a warm sun was shining and the population did not display any animosity towards us, so it was a very pleasant experience. We were looking forward to another day of leisure when, on May the 24th, our hopes were rudely dashed with the shout, "Be ready to depart at 0100 hours." In the afternoon, we learned that Bismarck had sunk the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, but had herself been slightly damaged. We were now prepared, if required, to sortie from Trondheim and bring the Bismarck back to Norway, but when I came back on watch next morning, I checked the compass and it showed a course of 190 degrees or nearly due south, which meant we were on our way home. The sea became so rough that day that movement across the deck was dangerous. In the afternoon of May the 24th, we returned to Bergen, and as we approached the city, we were overwhelmed by the beauty and peace of the sight in front of us. Someone mumbled, to live here," which expressed everyone's feelings. After a short while, however, our tender returned from the city and almost immediately our propeller started to turn again. We now traveled through the inner passage between the Norwegian coast and the islands, and it was almost like a river journey. Sometimes we seemed to be surrounded by mountains, but the Norwegian pilots we brought on board knew their business and always found the correct route. They left us near Stavanger, and on the afternoon of the next day, May the 25th, 1941, while passing through the Skagerrak, the other two destroyers headed for Kiel while we continued on to our home port of Wesermünde. On our way, we learned that the beautiful and mighty Bismarck had been sunk by superior British naval forces, and we felt terribly guilty for not having been there to defend her. In this connection, it is worth mentioning the story widely known in German naval circles during the war. It concerns an officer who also wanted to protect the Bismarck but failed, through no fault of his own, to do so. Kapitänleutnant Herbert Wohlfahrt was a well-known officer in our submarine service whose nickname was Parzival after the heroic medieval knight. In the spring of 1941, Wohlfahrt, whose name literally translates into welfare, took over a new U-boat, U-556, and was at Rotenhafen working up at the same time as the Bismarck. The story goes that one day when both vessels were exercising in the Baltic, Wohlfahrt signaled the captain of the battleship, CO to CO, "You have a mighty fine ship." He then dove U-556, came up on the other side of Bismarck and signaled a second time. CO to CO, question, "Can you do that too?" He received a serious dressing down for his impertinence from Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann, the captain of Bismarck, but the two later became friends after Lindemann sent his ship's band to play at a ceremony involving U-556. In return, Wohlfahrt prepared a medieval-looking document which stated that his boat would always guard the battleship from all enemies, complete with a drawing of Parseval deflecting torpedoes from Bismarck with his sword. Lindemann liked this document so much that he had it framed and hung it in the battleship's wardroom. In one of those ironic incidents that happened in war, Wohlfahrt was returning from his first patrol in U-556 when, during the evening of May 25, 1941, his bridge lookout sighted two large warships immediately ahead. Wohlfahrt crash dived to periscope depth, and when he looked through his periscope, found himself staring at the British aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battlecruiser HMS Renown steaming directly at him. Unfortunately, Wohlfahrt had expended all his torpedoes and could do nothing but watch helplessly as the two enemy warships passed by him just a few hundred yards away. That evening, the Ark Royal launched an airstrike on Bismarck which crippled the German ship's steering gear and ultimately doomed her to destruction. Wohlfahrt followed the two British ships on the surface to become a distant spectator of this action and could actually see Bismarck's gun flashes before he was forced to turn away for France as he was short on fuel. Such are the fortunes that fate sometimes has in store. To return to the Hans Lody, after our arrival in Wesermünde, we Kadetten were warned of another inspection on the following day, which required an immediate trip to the barber. This inspection, really a test, involved us reciting what we had learned, and we passed with flying colors. This marked the end of our assignment to the Hans Lody, and we packed our things and said farewell to the many friends we had made, seamen as well as officers. We were all somewhat sad to leave a ship that had been our home for the last 3 months, and envied those that could look forward to seeing more action in her. After leaving the Lody, I sent my bag straight to Flensburg-Mürwik, where I had to report to the Marineschule, but only after 5 glorious days of leave at home in Blankenfelde. After action report time, oh man, I always get flashbacks to my own time in training in the army when reading these types of stories. It feels as if it was just yesterday. I also find it quite interesting how similar the experience back then was to my own. For example, the persistent rumors that the food had been spiked with chemicals to dampen the libido of young recruits. I've heard the same thing myself countless times. For us, it was claimed that they put something called hengulin in the mess drinks, which very roughly translates to flacidone. Well, for me personally, I can tell you that it did not work. Anyway, we also had to do social events in full black tie, where our training officers would then grade our table manners. I enjoyed these very much. Familiar to me as well as returning viewers is the sleek destroyer Z-10 Hans Lody, who the well-versed mind remembers from the Battleship Bismarck series by Graf von Müllenheim-Rechberg, also available on this channel, who was aboard Bismarck during her breakout attempt and was accompanied by the Z-10. The same goes for U-556, about which I have talked at length in the Iron Coffin series, because it was a sister boat of one that the author served on. There, I have also given a bit of background on the special bond between Bismarck and U-556, so check it out if you like. Now, this is it for today. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next episode. Cheers!